On Christmas Day, December 25th, 2007, three friends sat in their vehicle in the parking lot just outside of the San Francisco Zoo. They were 17-year-old Carlos Souza Jr. and two brothers, 19-year-old Paul and 23-year-old Colbert Dollywall. As the three sat there, they passed around a bottle of vodka, splitting it between the three of them, and then they decided to get a little high. Once the three were good and inebriated, they got out of their vehicle and they headed into the zoo. We don't know everything they did the whole time they were in there, but at some point, a female witness came forward and told zoo staff that three young men were at the lion enclosure and they were taunting the lions. They were throwing their hands up in the air and yelling and screaming at the lions. Well, about an hour after she reported that, the zoo closed. It was 5 p.m. closing time, but the three young men, instead of making their way out of the zoo, decided to visit one last enclosure. And when they got there, they climbed up on a small metal railing and they looked 13 feet down into this enclosure and they began to taunt the animal that was inside. They again were throwing their hands up in the air, yelling and screaming, and in some reports, they were even picking up sticks and pine cones and throwing those things at this animal. Now, the inhabitant of this enclosure just so happened to be a 4-year-old Siberian tiger named Tatiana, and Tatiana was not appreciating this behavior. And we know that because just after the young men started doing this, Tatiana went lunging at her enclosure wall, and she somehow managed to jump 13 feet, basically vertically up in the air, and grabbed onto the concrete top lip of that enclosure. And she got enough purchase to where she was able to pull herself up, over, and out. And when she got out, she immediately lunged at the boys, and she tackled Paul to the ground. She was biting at his arms and at his midsection, but pretty quickly she lost interest in Paul for whatever reason, and she turned her sights on Carlos. When she tackled Carlos to the ground, she started to do some major damage. Again, she was biting at his arms, at his torso. She's clawing him up with her paws, and then she bit down on his neck several times. And when she did that, she severed one of his carotid arteries. Now, that in itself would have been a fatal wound, but she didn't stop there. We know that she ended up biting down on his head multiple times. And when she did that, she fractured his skull and she left multiple deep puncture wounds in his skull. And of course, that also was fatal. So Carlos passed away right then and there. Meanwhile, Paul and his brother Colbert, they ran away and they ran to the nearest structure, which was the cafe, the zoo cafe. When they got there, though, the cafe was closed and it was locked because, again, the zoo had closed down. But when they got there, they began to yell and scream out for help, and eventually some zoo workers would hear them. And after a few seconds of figuring out that this was not a prank, they called police. Well, some 10 to 15 minutes went by, and for whatever reason, the tiger did not come after anyone else initially. It was probably busy with Carlos' body. But after maybe 15 minutes or so, the two brothers were terrified to see that the tiger was coming right for them. It came walking towards the cafe, and at least initially, it had Carlos in its mouth, and it was dragging him along, leaving a long trail of blood behind Carlos. But when the tiger saw the two brothers, it dropped Carlos and it charged them and immediately began to maul them again. But it wasn't nearly as vicious an attack as it had done on Carlos. But the tiger begins to maul them again, but very quickly, two police officers did show up. The only problem was when they got there, the tiger was on top of Paul, actively mauling him. So they had their service pistols, but they were afraid to shoot because they were afraid to hit Paul. But after just a few seconds, the tiger dropped Paul and it turned, it saw the police officers, and it went charging at them. And when it did that, the two officers opened fire. They fired an unknown number of shots, but presumably striking it several times. Eventually, the final shot struck Tatiana right in the forehead, and of course, this wound was fatal. The zoo was closed down for a couple days after this event, and there was an investigation launched where it was found out that the wall to the tiger enclosure, which was 12 and a half feet high, was much shorter than it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be 16 and a half feet high. So there were renovations done where they raised the height of that wall to the required level, and then they added an additional couple feet of glass wall on top of that. and they added some electrical wire just to make sure that this never happened again. The two brothers, Paul and Kulbir, they sued and they won $900,000. They settled out of court for $900,000 for their injuries. And the family of Carlos sued for wrongful death. The result of that settlement is unknown. On May 18, 2007, a 57-year-old woman named Petronella Yvonne de Hoorde arrived at the Rotterdam Zoo in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. She was there with her husband, and the two of them were there specifically to see someone who Petronella considered to be one of her very best friends in the world. She had been visiting this friend for the past 11 years, since he lived at a totally different zoo in Berlin, but he had since been transferred to Rotterdam. And so now she showed up at least 4 days every single week to sit and be with this friend of hers. Well, when they got into the zoo, they made their way to the African apes enclosure, and when they got there, they saw her friend, and Yvonne, she would stand there and smile and look directly into his eyes, and he would look directly back at her and smile right back. And to Petronella, she believed that this behavior meant that they had this very close bond, they were good friends, just inseparable. But to her friend, that is not what this would have meant, because her friend was a 400-pound, 11-year-old silverback gorilla named Bokito. And to a male gorilla, smiling and staring directly at somebody, making eye contact with them, is a sign of dominance and aggression. And so basically, to Petronella, she thinks they've got this wonderful relationship. Meanwhile, for the past 11 years, she's been showing up 4, 5, 6 times a week and just challenging this gorilla. Well, on this particular day, Bokito had not had a good morning. Now, I don't know if Petronella and her husband realized that the gorilla was way overly agitated or not, but earlier in the day, some children had showed up at the exhibit and they were taunting Bokito and they were throwing rocks at him. And the gorilla had just progressively got angrier and angrier and angrier. Well, eventually the kids were either forced to leave or they just left on their own, I'm not sure, but it didn't matter. He was still very upset. And when Petronella showed up and he saw her, this apparently was just the last straw, because here's this person who's been taunting him in his mind for the last 11 years. He's already upset. And apparently, according to zoo officials and other animal behavior experts, this is probably what caused him to just snap. Well, after a little while of sitting there staring at each other, Petronella and her husband, they turned away and they began to walk away. And then all of a sudden behind them, they heard this splash and a thud. And when they turned around, Bokito had somehow managed to get out of his enclosure, and he was now standing on the footpath directly behind him. Now, his enclosure had a 3.5-meter wide moat that was filled with water. Nobody really knows how he crossed that. And then there was a wall. And then in some reports, it even says there was a 7,000-volt electric fence atop that wall. I wasn't able to verify that, but in at least two reports, they say he made it through that fence as well. Either way, he somehow managed to escape his enclosure. We're not really positive how he did it. But again, they heard the splash, the thud, and now he was on the footpath right behind him. And when they turned and looked and they stared at each other, Petronella was horrified to see that this huge gorilla just immediately picked her out of this massive crowd of people, went charging up to her, it grabbed her by the arm, and it jerked her to the ground. And when it did that, it shattered the bones in her wrist, it shattered most of the bones in her hand, and it fractured her forearm in 2 places. Now, when it ripped her to the ground, Bokito immediately, he just sat on top of her with his full 400 pounds of weight, and he just began to savagely bite her all over her body. He did this for quite some time. He inflicted over 100 bite wounds on her. I have absolutely no idea what her husband or other bystanders were doing at this point, other than most of the people were fleeing and seeking refuge in the nearby zoo restaurant. Well, after Bokito was done biting her, he grabbed her and he began to drag her towards that restaurant until he kind of lost interest in her, and thank goodness he dropped her. She was able to get up and walk away, flee under her own power. But now, here's Bokito, and he's got this restaurant in front of him, and he goes tearing inside this restaurant, which is full of people that are in there hiding. And he's going tearing through there. He's pushing chairs and tables aside and breaking glass and pushing people out of the way. He injured 3 more people in there, but not seriously. Eventually, after an hour of this gorilla going on this rampage, I have no idea why it took this long, but zoo staff were able to barricade him inside that restaurant. They got in there with a tranquilizer gun, they tranquilized him, and then they safely were able to get him back into his enclosure. After this whole event, Petronella was rushed to the hospital where she underwent 2 surgeries. She would eventually make a full recovery, and later she would state that Bokito was still her darling, her sweetheart, and she knew they still had this wonderful bond, the two of them, and she would continue to visit him at that zoo until the date of his death, which was 16 years later in 2023. He died unexpectedly when he became ill, and then he was put under anesthesia so they could check out what was going on with him, and he just never woke up again. On December 30th, 2018, a 22-year-old young woman named Alexandra, or more affectionately known as Alex Black, was working at the Conservators Center in Burlington, North Carolina. Now, the Conservators Center is an animal conservatory, so think kind of like small zoo, although it's not really a zoo. She was just working there as an intern, but she absolutely adored it. She loved working with animals. She had just graduated from the Indiana University, where she had a degree in working with animals, and then she had done like 3 internships working with animals prior to this one. But she got this wonderful opportunity out in North Carolina, and apparently she just absolutely loved it. Well, on this day, her job was to clean out one of the animal enclosures. Now, the animals that she was cleaning their enclosure for were not safe to be around. So when she went in there, they would have had to separate these animals away from Alex and the other intern who went in there. These animals were African lions. They had 14 of them at this conservatory. So anyways, the main trainer, she goes and she separates these lions from one part of the enclosure into the other. Just think like a big metal, basically chain link enclosure, and then there's a gate leading to another chain link enclosure. So they just open that gate, they get the lions all on one side, and then they close and secure the gate. And then it's safe for Alex and the other intern and the main animal trainer, a woman named Ashley Watts, to go in and clean. So that's what they do. They go in and they're cleaning for a little while. Well, what apparently nobody noticed was that one of these African lions, a 14-year-old male named Makai, started playing around with the gate that separates him from where these 3 women are. Well, we don't know exactly how Makai managed to do this, whether or not somebody made a mistake and just did not secure the gate properly, or whether he was somehow able to manipulate the mechanism, the lock mechanism, like lift it up or something. We don't really know. As far as I know, the investigation never revealed how exactly he was able to do this, but he was able to open that gate. And then there was nothing separating this enormous lion from these 3 women. And as soon as he opened the gate, he went sprinting in and went directly after Alex, and he began to attack Alex. Now, the main animal trainer that was in there, Ashley Watts, she initially tried to separate Makai, get him away from Alex, but she couldn't do it. She got him kind of through the gate a little bit and tried to close it, but before she could, Makai grabbed Alex by the ankle and dragged her through into his side of the enclosure. Well, they really had nothing else they could do, so they closed the gate. They went sprinting away. The intern and Ashley, the main trainer, went sprinting away to go get help. They called authorities, of course. They went and got a tranquilizer gun, and they came back, and by this time, Makai has got Alex on the ground. He's viciously mauling her, and at some point, he grabs her by the neck, like around the neck and the throat, and he just starts dragging her all around the enclosure. Now, at this point, I don't really know what state Alex was in, but I don't think it was a good state. This lion's, again, got her by the neck. It's dragging her by the neck all over this enclosure, basically just like playing with her as if she was some sort of toy. Well, they got this tranquilizer gun, and they start trying to trank this lion. They try it several times, and for whatever reason, it doesn't work. I don't know if they were unable to get a good hit on Makai, or if the chemicals, the agent was just not working on Mackay. I don't know, but they tried several times and it did not work. Well, eventually, after a few minutes, the fire department showed up. When the fire department showed up, Mackay still had Alex around the neck and it was still dragging her around this enclosure. And at this point, it was clear that Alex was in really bad shape. There was blood all over the place. Lions got her by the neck. There's lots of blood coming out of her neck. And the fire department, the only thing that they could think to do was to try and use their fire hose to get this lion away from her. So they got their fire hose and they started spraying Mackay with the fire hose. This did not work. The animal still did not drop Alex. Shortly after the fire department, the police showed up. And when the police got there, unfortunately, the only thing that they could do to try and help Alex and recover her was to kill Mackay. So they shot Mackay 8 times. It took 8 blasts from a shotgun to bring down this lion. When Mackay passed away, when Mackay died, they went in, they recovered Alex. But of course, it was too late. Alex suffered from massive, massive trauma to multiple parts of her body, but mainly to her throat and neck. That was what the coroner determined the fatal wound was. She had deep lacerations in her neck and throat, and she would have bled out probably very, very, very quickly, judged by, the wounds. Her family was obviously devastated when this took place. She had just been working as an intern at the center for 10 days when this occurred, and it's the day before Christmas. Obviously, they were devastated, but they did come out and say, you know what? At least she died doing exactly what she loved.